The police reports tell one story, the newspapers tell another. But those who were there, those who remember, they know the truth was never found. They know that whatever happened that night, whatever was left behind, was never meant to be understood. It began like any other case, a missing person, a body, a few scattered clues. But what made this different, what made this unforgettable, were the details that didn't make sense, the timeline that didn't match, the evidence that seemed to disappear before it was ever recorded, and the one person who swore they saw everything before vanishing without a trace. The official investigation ended years ago, but if you ask the people who still remember, they'll tell you this was never just another case. This was something else entirely. A question no one wants to ask, a story no one wants to tell. Tonight, we're telling it anyway. The story you're about to hear isn't something you'll find in any textbook. It's not the kind of case that gets solved with a neat conclusion or a heroic detective who ties up every loose end. No, this one has resisted explanation for years, and maybe that's why it remains so unsettling. People want answers, but the deeper you go, the more questions you'll find. Answers don't exist here, or at least the ones you'll hear will only make things even more chilling. This is the story of the murder of Caroline Myers, a case that has perplexed investigators for nearly a decade. It began in a small town that many people have never heard of, a place that would have faded from memory if not for the events that followed. At first, it appeared to be just another tragedy. A woman in her mid-30s found dead in her home under strange circumstances. She had been missing for nearly 48 hours before her body was discovered, locked away in her own home. The door was bolted from the inside, the windows locked, and the silence. The silence was unlike anything the police had ever encountered. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no DNA. Everything looked eerily untouched. The only clue, a single word written in bold, uneven letters on the wall of her living room. It was a word that should have been familiar, but in this context, it didn't make any sense. This word wasn't a message, not a typical warning. It was as if something wanted to make sure it was there, like someone had to leave it behind. But who and why? The word read, abandon. The police were baffled. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of robbery, no leads to follow. Just a word, a single cryptic clue, and a woman left dead in a locked room. People started talking. Rumors spread quickly about the house, about the word. Theories began to form. Some people said the house was cursed, that it had been haunted long before Caroline Myers moved in. Others whispered that it wasn't the first time a death like this had happened, though there were no records to prove it. The town's history was buried under layers of dust, long forgotten, but Caroline's death would bring all of that back, and with it, an unsettling suspicion that perhaps there was something more to this case than anyone was willing to admit. You see, the thing about small towns is they hide secrets, deep, dark ones, secrets that can remain buried for years, but once they come to light, they change everything. Caroline Myers' death, it wasn't just the death of a woman. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that no one ever expected and no one was prepared for. And as we move deeper into the investigation, you'll start to see why the town, the police, and even the people closest to Caroline all seem to be hiding something that, for reasons we may never fully understand, they all agreed was better left buried. It's been over 7 years since Caroline Myers was found in her home, but there are still those who believe someone knows more than they're telling. There are whispers in the shadows of the case, lingering questions that no one wants to answer. And some even claim that there are those who are still afraid to speak out, fearing that if they do, they'll become the next target of the unseen forces that seem to follow her death. So what really happened to Caroline Myers? Was she the victim of a tragic, senseless act of violence? Or was she simply a pawn in something far more elaborate, something carefully planned and executed by a force no one fully understands? As we explore this story, one thing is certain. What you'll learn today is not just a mystery, it's a warning. Every investigation begins with a timeline, the last known movements of the victim, the final phone call, the last message sent, the last time someone saw them alive. But in the case of Caroline Myers, the timeline is not just incomplete, it's fractured, broken into pieces that don't fit together. And that's where the real story begins. On the evening of October 12th, Caroline left work at exactly 6:42 p.m. She was seen on the security footage of a gas station at 7:03, buying a bottle of water and a pack of gum. She paid in cash. She didn't seem in a hurry. She didn't look over her shoulder. There was nothing to indicate she felt unsafe. But then, she vanished. No more security footage. No more transactions. No eyewitnesses who could place her anywhere after that. By all accounts, Caroline should have been home by 7:30, but she wasn't. And the most disturbing part? The next confirmed sighting of her wasn't until nearly 24 hours later by the person who found her body. Where was she during those missing hours? Who was she with? And why did no one report anything unusual? Her phone records provided no answers, no calls, no texts, no data usage, just silence. Almost as if someone had wiped everything clean, almost as if she had simply stopped existing for an entire day. The police searched for an explanation. They interviewed friends, family, co-workers. They retraced her steps over and over again. But the more they searched, the more contradictions they found. Neighbors claimed they heard something strange the night before her body was discovered, a single sharp sound, like a heavy object dropping to the floor, followed by nothing. Others swore they saw a figure standing near her house that night, motionless, watching, but no one could describe the person. Every answer led to another question. And then there was the house itself. Her front door was locked from the inside, the windows secured, no sign of forced entry. And yet, Caroline's body was found sprawled in the center of her living room, her eyes wide open, her hands clutching at something invisible, as if she had tried to fight off nothing, or something that no one else could see. The autopsy provided little clarity. There were no external injuries, no signs of a struggle. Cause of death? Officially listed as undetermined, but there was one detail that couldn't be ignored. Her heart. It had stopped abruptly, as if something had caused an overwhelming shock, something so intense that her body simply gave up. But what could do that to a person? What could terrify someone so completely that their own heart would betray them? There was no answer, but there was one more clue, and it was found where no one expected to find anything at all. It wasn't the police who found her. It wasn't a concerned friend or a worried family member. It was a stranger, a man whose name barely made it into the case files. He was a real estate agent, assigned to show a nearby property that morning. He parked his car across the street from Caroline Myers' home at exactly 6:58 a.m. The sun had barely risen. The streets were empty. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, he ignored it, focused on his clipboard, the details of his appointment. But then he noticed something, a single porch light still on despite the daylight creeping in. A small detail, nothing remarkable. But the closer he looked, the more unusual it seemed. The curtains in the living room were drawn, but they weren't fully closed. And through that narrow gap, something caught his eye. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Just a shape, a shadow. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. Someone was inside, motionless, staring back. He knocked, once, twice. No answer. He waited, knocked again. Still nothing. But the feeling, that pressing gut-deep certainty that something was wrong, only grew stronger. He took a step back, reached for his phone, and then he saw the door. It was unlocked. He was sure of it. He didn't turn the knob, didn't push it open, but something had already disturbed it, just enough that it wasn't fully shut. And then came the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, not at first, just something faint, stale. But beneath it was something else, something metallic, something unmistakable. The moment he realized what it was, he was already dialing 911. When officers arrived, the first thing they noticed was the silence, a thick, unnatural stillness, the kind that doesn't just exist. It presses in, suffocates. Even the radios on their belts seemed quieter. No feedback, no static, just nothing. The front door was, as the real estate agent had described, unlocked but not fully open. The officers announced their presence, stepped inside, and then they saw her. Caroline Myers was lying in the center of the living room floor, her body perfectly still, her arms rigid, bent at unnatural angles. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes unblinking, fixed on something no one else could see. There was no blood, no bruises, no indication of a struggle, but her face told a different story. It wasn't just fear, it wasn't just terror, it was something worse, something deeper. Her pupils were dilated, her expression frozen in a way that defied explanation, almost as if she had seen something in the final moments before death that no living person was ever meant to see. The medical examiner would later confirm an unsettling detail. Caroline's body had no external injuries, no signs of a heart attack, no signs of an allergic reaction. Official cause of death? Unexplained physiological event. Unexplained. But there was one more thing, something that turned this case from tragic to deeply disturbing. Something the officers almost missed. It was the only object in the room that didn't belong to Caroline, a tape recorder, an old one, outdated, sitting upright on the coffee table as if someone had placed it there deliberately. And the most unsettling part? It was still running. Someone had pressed record, but no one had pressed stop. The officers retrieved the tape. They sent it for analysis. They played it back. For the first minute, there was nothing, just the sound of silence. Then, faintly, something else. A breath, a whisper, indistinct, just barely audible. Then another, and another, until, suddenly, the tape ended. No screams, no struggle, just breathe. Then silence, and finally, nothing. The tape was sent to the lab for analysis. Audio specialists examined it, filtering out static, amplifying frequencies beyond human hearing. They expected something, perhaps an indistinct shuffle, maybe the trace of a distant voice. But what they found was nothing. No interference, no external noise, no identifiable words. Just breathe, just waiting. Every investigator who listened to it reported the same thing, an overwhelming sense of unease, not fear, not dread. Something worse, a feeling that whatever they were listening to was still listening back. The medical examiner worked methodically. Caroline Myers' body showed no signs of external trauma, no signs of internal distress. Toxicology reports came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol, nothing that could explain her sudden death. But there was one thing, one single abnormality. The muscles in her face, the ones responsible for expression, for movement, had been locked in place. Rigid, frozen, but not in rigor mortis. No, this was different. It was as if she had died in the exact moment of experiencing something so incomprehensible. Her body refused to let go of it. A permanent record of her final emotion carved into her flesh. Investigators reconstructed Caroline's final hours, Her last phone call was to a coworker at 8:47 p.m. Routine, casual, nothing unusual. At 9:12 p.m., she was seen on security footage at a convenience store, buying a single bottle of water. She looked normal, unbothered, unafraid. She arrived home at exactly 9:30 p.m. The lights in her living room flickered once, confirmed by a neighbor who glanced through their window. And then, from that moment on, nothing. Her phone was never used again. No outgoing messages, no browsing history, no signs of distress. Just complete, absolute inactivity. The last verifiable moment she was alive was stepping through her front door. The next recorded movement in that house came nearly 10 hours later, when the real estate agent noticed her through the window. What happened in those missing hours? Theories spread quickly. Some investigators leaned towards the possibility of a medical anomaly, perhaps an undetected condition, a stroke, an undiagnosed neurological disorder. But none of it explained the expression frozen on her face. None of it explained the recorder, still running. None of it explained the feeling. Others turned to something less tangible. They noted the flickering lights. The reports from neighbors, who later claimed they had heard something faint from her house that night, something like a voice, but not quite. But the most disturbing theory came from an unexpected place: her own journal. Found tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail on her kitchen counter, it was filled with mundane details: work notes, reminders, grocery lists. But the last entry, written the night before she died, was different. "Something is in the house. I heard it last night. It was breathing." There was no further explanation, no follow-up, just that single statement left behind like an unanswered question. Investigators searched for an intruder. They found no forced entry, no disturbed locks, no footprints. The house was empty. Nothing missing, nothing added, except the recorder. To this day, no one knows who placed it there, or why. Months later, the case was cold. No new leads, no new evidence. Caroline Myers was just another unsolved mystery, another name in the files. But then, something happened. A technician, reviewing the tape one final time, isolated a frequency no one had noticed before, buried beneath the breath, beneath the silence. It was Caroline's voice, and she was whispering, "I see you." But there was no one else in the room. The Caroline Myers case was officially closed. There was no evidence of foul play, no proof of an intruder, no cause of death that medical science could explain. The case file was stamped, sealed, and archived among countless other unresolved investigations. But those who worked on it never truly moved on. It's easy to dismiss a mystery when there's no answer. Easier still to move past what we cannot understand. But the problem with forgetting something is that it never truly disappears. For years, the recording sat untouched in the evidence room, a forgotten relic of an unsolved case. And then something strange happened. During a routine audit, an officer tasked with logging evidence noticed something off. The label on the tape, which had once read Myers-9/14, was now faded, the ink smudged beyond recognition. Curious, they played it back, expecting to hear the same breath, the same silence, the same inexplicable nothingness. But the recording had changed. "I see you." Only this time, there was something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if fingers were lightly drumming against a wooden surface. Slow, deliberate. The tape was immediately re-examined. Experts were called in: digital forensics, sound engineers, specialists trained to detect tampering. No evidence of alteration, no trace of editing. The tape was exactly as it had always been. Except it wasn't. 2 years after Caroline Myers was found, the house went back on the market. It sold quickly. Too quickly, some might say. A young couple, eager for a fresh start, moved in without hesitation. They repainted, repaired, renovated. And for a time it was quiet, normal, safe, until one night, just after 3 a.m., the new homeowner woke suddenly, a sharp electric jolt of awareness, like something unseen had shaken him from sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. There was no sound, no movement, nothing but the rhythmic ticking of the clock on his nightstand. And then, just as his eyes began to close, he heard it. "I see you." The couple moved out 3 days later. They never spoke about why, never filed complaints, never reported anything unusual. But the house remains vacant to this day. Online forums dissected the case, poring over every detail, every inconsistency. Ghost hunters visited the property, hoping for proof. Some claimed they felt something watching them. Others left without explanation. But the most unsettling story came from a woman who had never set foot inside the house. She had never met Caroline Myers, never heard of the case. Until one night she woke suddenly. Her phone screen was on, though she hadn't touched it. A message was typed into the Notes app, waiting, as if something, had left it there. 3 words, no explanation, no context. "I see you." Some stories refuse to be forgotten. Some questions will never be answered, and maybe, just maybe, some things were never meant to be understood. But tell me, what do you think happened to Caroline Myers? Let me know in the comments below, and if you made it this far, consider subscribing, because there are more stories like this, waiting, watching, never truly gone. I see you.